Welcome back to Beyond the Known and our ongoing deep dive into the captivating world of ancient Egypt.
Great to be back.
Today, we're continuing our journey through this timeless civilization, but we're not just hitting the highlights. We're digging into the pivotal moments and the fascinating individuals that truly shaped this incredible history for you.
Yeah, definitely getting into the details. And what's fascinating to consider right from the outset is Alexander the Great's vision when he founded Alexandria. This wasn't just another city springing up.
Right.
You had this open strategic location right on the Mediterranean coast. Now, if we connect this to the bigger picture of Egypt up to that point, you see a civilization that geographically was very much focused inward along the Nile. Their interaction and orientation weren't primarily towards the sea in the same way as other Mediterranean powers.
Right, that sense of being somewhat insulated by their natural borders, the deserts, the Nile itself acting as both a lifeline and a barrier with its cataracts. It really seems to have fostered a more inward-looking perspective, didn't it?
Absolutely. So for Alexander to come in and immediately see the potential of this coastal location for a major port, it really speaks to his forward-thinking approach, his understanding of trade and connection, a stark contrast to that more traditional Egyptian focus.
Yeah, a completely different mindset.
And the city planning itself is quite remarkable. They laid it out in this very deliberate grid pattern, streets meeting at right angles.
Mm-hmm.
What's particularly insightful is the reported use of grain, rather than chalk, to mark out the initial layout.
Grain, seriously.
Yeah. Beyond just being a practical solution in open land, using grain highlights a really resourceful early application of their agricultural wealth in urban planning. And the design itself, oriented to capture those Mediterranean breezes, represents a very practical and, forward-thinking approach to urban living.
It paints such a vivid picture, doesn't it? Using something as fundamental as grain to map out this grand urban center. And thinking about Alexander's motivations, it wasn't solely about military dominance, was it? It was more.
Exactly. It was about establishing these crucial hubs for commerce, for the exchange of ideas. He wasn't just thinking about immediate power. He was really playing a longer game, looking ahead.
Definitely.
Precisely. Now, let's not overlook the sheer scale of Alexander's military force, around 50,000 men. The logistical challenges of sustaining an army of that size in the ancient world are almost hard for us to fully comprehend today.
Okay, let's unpack this. 50,000 people on the move. Where do you even begin to think about supplying their basic needs? The demand for water alone must have been enormous. A handful of local wells simply wouldn't have cut it.
Exactly. Historical accounts suggest that even a dozen wells would have left them severely undersupplied. And then you have the monumental task of feeding that many individuals day after day, month after month. Small villages along their route simply wouldn't have had the surplus to sustain them.
So their movements weren't just dictated by strategic military objectives. They were fundamentally constrained by the absolute necessities of survival. Where could they access reliable water sources? Where could they find enough food? It really grounds these grand campaigns in a very tangible reality.
What's fascinating here is how these very basic needs actually shaped the direction and pace of Alexander's conquests. They had to move towards available resources. In some instances, they even required ships solely for the purpose of transporting water for the troops. It wasn't simply a case of drawing a line on a map and marching,
Right, right. And if you were one of those soldiers, you were essentially signing up for a protracted commitment, potentially a decade away from your home and family. It really shifts your perspective on time, on personal connections.
It does indeed. These were long-term deployments. And the idea of a quick return home was simply not a realistic expectation. It fostered a different kind of mindset, a remarkable degree of resilience. And it wasn't just the fighting men. You had this entire accompanying infrastructure, merchants, provisioners, even women and children traveling with this massive army.
This sprawling, mobile entity stretching all the way from Babylon to the edges of India. It's incredible. And remarkably, Alexander's army maintained an unbroken record of victory. That in itself contributes to the almost mythical status he attained, right?
Oh, definitely. That consistent string of successes certainly fueled the belief in his invincibility. But even amidst constant victories, it wasn't without immense strain. By the time they reached India, the troops were physically and mentally exhausted, finally compelling Alexander to turn back. It speaks to both his exceptional leadership in pushing them so far and his ultimate pragmatism in recognizing their limits.
Okay, shifting our focus now to a different kind of power structure. The significant role of royal women in ancient Egypt, and the intriguing aspects of their influence on royal succession.
This is where we see some truly fascinating dynamics at play. you encountered this title, the heiress, which wasn't about inheriting material possessions in the traditional sense. Instead, it signified a woman's crucial role in legitimizing the king's right to rule. Particularly in the 18th dynasty, the underlying principle seems to have been that the royal woman, through her lineage, essentially conferred kingship upon her husband or son.
So quite different from the strictly patrilineal systems we often see elsewhere, like the English monarchy with its clear line of male primogeniture. Egyptian succession wasn't so rigidly defined then.
Not at all. Surprisingly, they never actually codified formal written rules for royal succession. This might seem counterintuitive to us, but their profound belief in Ma'at, that cosmic balance and order that governed all things, was so deeply ingrained that they perhaps felt explicit laws weren't strictly necessary. The natural order, guided by the divine, would ultimately prevail.
Interesting. And this brings us to the pharaohs theory, the idea that marriage to the woman possessing the purest royal blood, typically the daughter of the reigning king and queen, was a primary key to legitimately becoming king.
Exactly. It wasn't solely about being the eldest son, although that certainly played a role in many instances. The most direct path to the throne, or at the very least a critical component of it, was through marriage to a woman who carried that strong, undiluted royal lineage through her mother. This significantly elevated the social and political standing of royal women.
Right.
So the crucial insight here for understanding Egyptian power dynamics is that royal women weren't just consorts, they were actively legitimizing the rule of the pharaoh.
Let's pivot again and delve into the military campaigns and some of the more striking practices of the time. Ahmose, having just successfully expelled the Hyksos, immediately turns his attention south to Nubia, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. And the historical accounts we have depict a campaign marked by considerable brutality, great slaughter, and the acquisition of spoil, which included the taking of captives. However, one particularly striking detail that emerges is the method employed for counting the enemy dead.
3 hands. Ahmose I is recorded as boasting about bringing back 3 hands. That's not referring to prisoners, is it?
No. In ancient Egyptian military practice, this was a grimly efficient method of tallying enemy casualties. Military scribes would accompany the army, responsible for meticulously recording various forms of war, booty captives, livestock, and, crucially, the number of enemies killed.
Okay.
On a chaotic battlefield, physically counting individual bodies was highly impractical. Therefore, they would cut off the right hands of the slain enemy soldiers and collect them in piles to be counted by the scribes. So, when Ahmose first reports taking 3 hands, it signifies his personal killing of 3 enemy combatants. This practice underscores the brutal efficiency of ancient military administration.
Wow. That's a chillingly practical way of keeping score. And this military tradition apparently continued with his son, who also undertook a campaign in Nubia.
Indeed. And what's remarkable is that Ahmose, son of Ibana, the same military official who served with distinction under Ahmose I, was still active and participated in this subsequent Nubian campaign under the new pharaoh. He even meticulously recorded the details of this campaign on his tomb walls, providing us with invaluable first-hand insights into these military expeditions.
Still going strong. And his account describes even more intense scenes, the Egyptian forces surrounding Nubian archers, taking them captive, and the fleeing enemies being utterly decimated. It really emphasizes the effectiveness and the, ruthlessness of these early military campaigns.
It does. And through Ahmose son of Ibana's records, we see his own rise through the military ranks, accumulating wealth and elevated status with each successful campaign, a tangible reward system for effective military service. Now, coinciding with this period, we also see a significant innovation in royal burial practices under Amenhotep I.
The separation of his mortuary temple from his actual tomb. What was the rationale behind this change?
Well, the prevailing theory suggests that by locating these two structures in distinct areas, the aim was to deter potential tomb robbers. The mortuary temple, intended for public rituals and offerings, would be a more visible and regularly frequented site, while the actual burial chamber could remain more concealed, less of an obvious target for plunder.
Makes sense.
This separation of funerary complex and tomb would become a more widespread practice among subsequent pharaohs.
Then we have Thutmose, who, as we noted earlier, wasn't of direct royal lineage. How did he successfully ascend to power?
He distinguished himself through the ranks of the military and, crucially, solidified his claim by marrying the daughter of Ahmose I and Queen Ahmose Nefertari, a woman possessing a strong and undeniable royal heritage. This strategic marriage was the key to legitimizing his rule.
So we see that recurring theme of the pivotal role of royal women in succession once again. And like his predecessors, Thutmose also led military expeditions into Nubia.
Yes, but he pushed significantly further south than any pharaoh before him, venturing beyond the formidable Fourth Cataract of the Nile. It's important to remember that the cataracts were stretches of the river characterized by numerous large boulders and rapids, making navigation incredibly perilous.
Right.
These weren't leisurely voyages, they were arduous and potentially dangerous military undertakings.
And these campaigns were often strategically timed for May or June, the Nile's low water season.
Precisely. When the river was at its lowest level, the numerous rocks and boulders became more exposed, allowing for a more cautious navigation, often with the army positioned along both banks of the Nile to secure their passage.
There's also this intriguing geographical detail, a description of a bend in the Nile that apparently disoriented travelers, referred to as the water that turned one who wanted to go north into one who went south.
Ah, yes, that distinctive elbow, or sharp bend in the river's course, where the water seems to momentarily flow in the opposite direction. It must have been incredibly disorienting for ancient travelers, both visually and in terms of their understanding of the river's natural flow. Even the apparent position of the sunrise would have seemed wrong at that point.
And Thutmose I, with our familiar figure Ahmose, son of Ibana, still serving alongside him, braved this challenging terrain. It was during this particular campaign that Ahmose, son of Ibana, was promoted to crew commander, further evidence of his successful and lengthy military career.
Correct. Now, consider the traditional burial sites of pharaohs up to this point, pyramids, various individual tombs. Thutmose initiated a significant departure from these customs.
He was the first pharaoh to have his tomb carved in the now famous Valley of the Kings, located on the west bank of Thebes.
Yes. The west bank of the Nile was already symbolically associated with the realm of the dead, as the sun died in the west each evening. The Valley of the Kings itself at that time was a relatively barren and isolated landscape. His architect, Eneni, oversaw the initial construction. And remarkably, even in modern times, visitors to the valley are often struck by the sparse vegetation and rugged terrain.
It really sets a dramatic scene, the secluded, rocky valley, chosen as the final resting place for the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. And unlike the earlier pyramids, these tombs were carved directly into the limestone cliffs themselves.
Precisely. Following Thutmose I's innovation, no subsequent pharaoh would be buried in a pyramid. The Valley of the Kings became the standard royal necropolis. Now, despite his military successes, Thutmose himself faced a potential succession crisis with the early deaths of his three sons. But let's transition to the fascinating reign of his daughter, Hatshepsut, and her notably close relationship with Senenmut.
Senenmut, right. A commoner who ascended to an almost unprecedented level of influence and power during Hatshepsut's rule. The sheer number and importance of the official titles he held is truly astonishing.
It is quite remarkable. He served as overseer of the royal palace, royal tutor to her daughter Nefer, overseer of the granaries of Amun, giving him control over vast temple resources, and overseer of the works, responsible for major architectural projects like the magnificent temple complex at Deir el-Bahari. And then there's the rather unusual detail of his apparent lifelong bachelorhood.
A prominent figure like Senenmut remaining a bachelor in ancient Egypt. That must have been a significant deviation from the norm, especially for someone in such powerful position.
Very unusual indeed. There's no record of a wife or any children. But what makes his story even more intriguing are the two elaborate tombs he had prepared for himself. The first, located on the west bank with a commanding view, was never actually used for his burial.
And inside this unused tomb, the remnants of his sarcophagus were discovered. A pink Aswan granite sarcophagus found shattered into pieces.
Exactly. It wasn't merely cracked or damaged. It appeared to have been deliberately destroyed. And upon reconstruction, it was discovered to be in the shape of a royal cartouche. And there's compelling evidence suggesting it was originally intended for Hatshepsut herself. She had apparently bestowed upon him her own royal sarcophagus.
Okay, this really deepens the intrigue. The gift of a royal sarcophagus to a non-royal individual, coupled with his extraordinary accumulation of high-ranking positions and his seemingly deliberate choice of bachelorhood, has certainly fueled considerable speculation about the nature of his relationship with Hatshepsut, suggesting it may have been more than purely political or professional.
It has indeed. Now let's turn our attention to the military technology of the era, which played a critical role in the campaigns we've been discussing. The chariot, for example, was a highly prized and effective weapon of war.
Those impressive chariots we see depicted in ancient Egyptian art, they weren't mass-produced, were they? They were intricately crafted pieces of technology.
Absolutely. They were constructed using three distinct types of wood, each selected for its specific properties. Ash, or poplar, for the main structural frame, a flexible wood for the wheels to absorb impact, and a strong yet pliable wood for the axles to withstand stress. This required the skills of highly specialized carpenters. They were essentially master craftsmen in their own right.
And their primary function on the battlefield was to serve as a mobile firing platform for archers.
Correct. Each chariot typically carried a crew of two, the driver, who controlled the horses, and the archer, who could unleash a rapid volley of arrows. And while they were a formidable military asset, they were also quite expensive to produce and maintain and prone to mechanical failure. An army on the move needed dedicated repairmen and a supply of spare parts to keep their chariots operational. So not exactly the ancient equivalent of a low-maintenance vehicle.
No kidding. So while the chariots provided a crucial tactical advantage, the majority of the army still consisted of the foot soldiers, the infantry, right?
Yes. If you wanted to gauge the speed and logistical capabilities of an ancient army on the march, you looked to the infantry. They were the ones covering the ground, typically managing perhaps 15 miles per day. They were generally armed with a spear or a sword for close combat and a shield for defense.
And these infantrymen were largely drawn from the lower social classes, and likely the vast majority were illiterate.
That's the prevailing understanding. Literacy rates in ancient Egypt were relatively low, estimated at perhaps no more than 20% of the overall population. So these were not necessarily highly skilled or educated soldiers in the modern sense, but they formed the essential backbone of the army, engaging in brutal face-to-face combat.
Now let's talk about Thutmose III, often considered one of Egypt's greatest military pharaohs. He must have presented a stark contrast to his predecessor, Hatshepsut.
He certainly did. It's likely he received extensive military training during Hatshepsut's co-regency. As soon as he assumed sole rule, in the second year of his reign, he launched his first major military campaign towards Megiddo in Syria-Palestine.
The Battle of Megiddo is quite renowned for his display of tactical brilliance, specifically his decision to take the less obvious Aruna Valley route to surprise the enemy coalition.
It was an undeniably bold and strategically sound maneuver. His own advisors reportedly cautioned against it, fearing they could be ambushed and annihilated while moving single file through the narrow pass. But Thutmose III, displaying his characteristic confidence and decisiveness, essentially declared that he would not expose his army to any danger he wasn't personally willing to face. He led the way, and his troops followed his example.
And that daring gamble paid off handsomely. They achieved complete surprise, routing the enemy forces outside the city of Megiddo. However, there was a significant tactical error made by the Egyptian army in the immediate aftermath of their victory, wasn't there?
Yes, unfortunately. Instead of immediately pursuing the fleeing enemy and securing the city, the Egyptian soldiers succumbed to the temptation of plundering the battlefield, seizing valuable items like bronze weapons, shields, and chariots. This period of looting allowed the majority of the defeated enemy forces to regroup and retreat within the fortified walls of Megiddo.
Oh, dear. So instead of a swift and decisive victory, they found themselves facing a protracted 7-month siege of the city.
Exactly. Their own desire for immediate spoils significantly prolonged the campaign. Sieging a heavily fortified city like Megiddo was a demanding and time-consuming undertaking, even with the Egyptians' advanced siege warfare techniques.
But Thutmose III's legacy extends beyond his impressive military victories. The detailed carvings in his temple at Karnak offer a fascinating window into the world he encountered on his campaigns.
Absolutely. Upon his return from Syria, he had the accounts of his expeditions meticulously inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Karnak. One particularly remarkable addition was what's often referred to as his botanical book, incredibly detailed depictions of the various plants and animals that he and his army had observed in Syria, flora, and fauna previously unknown in Egypt. It demonstrates a genuine curiosity about the natural world and a commitment to record-keeping.
That's pretty cool. And beyond military conquest, he also engaged in strategic diplomatic marriages, marrying 3 Syrian women during his reign.
Yes. While these unions were likely driven more by political considerations than romantic attachments, they served an important diplomatic purpose, helping to solidify alliances and maintain a degree of stability in the region, even while he continued to demand tribute from the conquered territories. It was a pragmatic approach to maintaining Egyptian influence.
Now, given his extensive military achievements and the potential for valuable grave goods, Thutmose III must have taken considerable precautions to safeguard his own final resting place, didn't he?
He certainly did. Likely acutely aware of the persistent threat of tomb robbery. He had his tomb constructed deep within the Valley of the Kings, located high up in the cliffs, far removed from the more accessible main entrance that visitors use today. It was a deliberate attempt to keep his tomb hidden and secure from potential desecration.
Smart move. Moving forward in time, we arrive at the reign of Amenhotep III and his influential great royal wife, Queen Tiye. This period seems to have been characterized by a significant level of prosperity and extensive diplomatic engagement with foreign powers.
It was indeed a golden age for Egypt. We see the administrative functions largely centered in Memphis, while Thebes retained its crucial religious significance, with the king frequently moving between the two major cities. And Amenhotep III employed a rather innovative method of disseminating important information during his reign.
Telegrams. What exactly does that term signify in the context of ancient Egypt?
Essentially, he dispatched official announcements far and wide across his kingdom, carved onto scarabs usually, detailing significant events, most notably including his marriage to Queen Tiye. This was a way of ensuring that news of important royal events reached a broad audience throughout Egypt, sort of like ancient press releases.
Got it. And it's quite notable that he explicitly stated that Queen Tiye was of commoner origins, which seems rather unusual for a pharaoh to emphasize.
It is. It speaks to his own sense of confidence and perhaps the depth of his affection and respect for her. While she wasn't of royal blood, her parents were nevertheless from a prominent and influential family, so she wasn't exactly from humble beginnings,
Right, right. This era also saw a flourishing of diplomatic ties and trade agreements with neighboring lands, didn't it?
Yes. Egypt's wealth wasn't solely derived from military conquest. They actively cultivated extensive trade networks. They also controlled significant gold mining operations in regions like Wadi Hammamat and Nubia, providing a strong economic foundation for their prosperity.
This widespread prosperity is clearly reflected in the elaborate and richly decorated tombs of wealthy officials during his reign, such as that of the mayor of Thebes, Ramesses.
Exactly. The sheer scale and artistic sophistication of these private tombs serve as a powerful indicator of the overall wealth, stability, and cultural flourishing of Egypt during Amenhotep III's rule. Now, his own mortuary temple on the West Bank at Thebes was absolutely immense, wasn't it? Though sadly, very little of it remains standing today.
Sadly, yes. Located on the Theban West Bank, much of the vast complex has been lost over time, largely due to the rising water table. Only the ground plans offer a hint of its original grandeur.
But we do still have the iconic colossi of Memnon, two massive stone statues that originally stood at the entrance to his mortuary temple, and his chosen burial location was also somewhat unconventional.
He opted for burial in a separate western spur of the Valley of the Kings, often referred to as the West Valley. He was the first pharaoh to be interred in that particular location. The precise reasons for this choice remain uncertain, though religious considerations are a possibility. And he and Queen Tiye had several children, including two sons who lived to adulthood.
Yes, the elder son, Thutmose, who was initially designated as the heir but predeceased his father, and his younger brother, who would eventually become the highly controversial Pharaoh Akhenaten, a ruler who would profoundly and dramatically alter the course of Egyptian history.
Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh. His unexpected succession and the radical reforms he implemented truly shook the very foundations of ancient Egyptian society.
Indeed. He was not the eldest son, and notably, his name is conspicuously absent from official inscriptions prior to his unexpected ascension to the throne. Once in power, he embarked on a course that challenged the three fundamental pillars of Egyptian civilization: the established military, the deeply entrenched religious system, and the traditional role and authority of the pharaoh himself.
Given the profoundly deep-rooted conservatism of Egyptian society, this period of radical change must have been incredibly disruptive and met with significant resistance.
Absolutely. For millennia, their unique geography and their unwavering belief in an unchanging divine order, in the concept of Ma'at, had fostered a powerful resistance to any significant deviation from tradition. Their art, their political structure, their religious beliefs, all were intended to be eternal and immutable.
And Akhenaten's most significant reform was the introduction of a form of monotheism centered on the worship of the Aten, the physical disk of the sun.
Yes. This represented a complete and utter upheaval of the traditional Egyptian pantheon of gods and goddesses. He ordered the closure of the temples dedicated to other powerful deities such as Amun, Ptah, Sekhmet, and Osiris, temples that wielded enormous economic and political influence throughout the land. This move undoubtedly provoked the deep-seated anger and opposition of the wealthy and influential priesthoods associated with these traditional cults.
Yeah, you don't mess with the temples. And he didn't stop at just religious reform. He went so far as to relocate the entire royal capital north to a newly constructed city, Akhenaten, at the site of modern-day Tel El Amarna.
A truly radical and unprecedented move, abandoning the traditional religious and political center of Thebes. He claimed that the Aten itself had revealed the location for this new holy city. Interestingly, the geography of the Tel El Amarna landscape features a prominent notch or horizon in the eastern mountains, which visually resembles the hieroglyph for horizon, or Akhet, a clear visual connection to his new solar faith.
This Aten that he championed was also a fundamentally different type of deity compared to the traditional Egyptian gods, wasn't it? Abstract and essentially imageless.
Precisely. Unlike the traditional anthropomorphic gods of Egypt, who are consistently depicted in human or animal form, the Aten was conceived as the radiant energy of the sun itself, a divine life force. This abstract nature was a completely novel and revolutionary concept in the history of Egyptian religious thought.
Even the artistic conventions of the period underwent a dramatic transformation, with depictions of Akhenaten and his royal family in surprisingly informal and affectionate everyday scenes.
Utterly unprecedented. We see him portrayed in intimate settings with his wife Nefertiti and their children openly displaying affection, even in humorous moments such as one depiction of his daughter Meritaten eating a duck. This informal and personal portrayal of the royal family was a stark and radical departure from the highly stylized and idealized imagery of the past.
But while Akhenaten was intensely focused on these radical internal religious and artistic reforms, it appears that Egypt's foreign affairs were largely neglected during his reign, weren't they?
Yes, Egypt's international standing and influence in the Near East significantly declined as Akhenaten's attention and resources were almost entirely consumed by his internal religious revolution. It seems diplomacy took a back seat.
The subsequent reign of his young successor, Tutankhamun, is still shrouded in considerable mystery, particularly concerning the identity of his parents.
Absolutely. Despite the incredible wealth and artifacts discovered within his largely intact tomb, there was no definitive inscription or artifact that unequivocally identified his father or mother. Howard Carter's monumental discovery of his tomb, largely funded by Lord Carnarvon, was a truly pivotal event in Egyptology, revealing an astonishing array of royal treasures.
That iconic golden burial mask is one of the most recognizable images of ancient Egypt. And the fact that his was the first virtually undisturbed royal mummy ever discovered is simply staggering.
It was. Carter himself famously remarked that while they had found the physical treasures, Tutankhamun himself had somehow eluded them, meaning his true identity, the circumstances of his short reign, and his ultimate fate remained open to considerable interpretation. Now, following Akhenaten's failed religious experiment, there was a swift return to the traditional religious practices under Tutankhamun, largely guided by his influential advisors. Following his brief reign and that of the short-lived Horemheb, a capable military commander, stepped in to restore stability and order.
Horemheb clearly recognized the enduring power and influence of the Amun priesthood and strategically reintegrated them into positions of power even within the military structure.
Exactly. He understood the necessity of reestablishing social and religious equilibrium and the significant influence wielded by the traditional religious establishment. He also implemented reforms within the military command, dividing it into northern and southern sections, likely to improve control and communication across the vast Egyptian territories.
And Horemheb went to considerable lengths to systematically erase the memory and legacy of Akhenaten and his immediate successors, didn't he? Like damnatio memoriae.
Yes. He erected a prominent stela that deliberately omitted the name of Tutankhamun entirely from the royal lineage. If you examine this stela in the Egyptian Museum today, you can clearly see that Horemheb's own royal cartouche is carved much deeper into the stone than the surrounding hieroglyphs, indicating a deliberate erasure and reinscription over a previous royal name, trying to rewrite history, essentially.
The dawn of the 19th dynasty saw the ascent of Ramesses I, a commoner who nonetheless possessed strong and influential military connections.
His selection as pharaoh, despite his lack of direct royal ancestry, underscores the critical need for stability and a strong hand on the reins of power following the turbulent Amarna period of the 18th dynasty. He had served as the vizier under Horemheb, and his own father had held the rank of general in the army, so he brought both administrative experience and military ties to the throne.
His son, Seti I, continued the tradition of active military campaigning, most notably at the Battle of Kadesh, and was also a significant patron of monumental construction, particularly at the Temple of Karnak.
Seti. I was very much a warrior king who understood the importance of projecting and maintaining Egyptian power and influence in the surrounding regions. His extensive additions to the Karnak temple complex, including the awe-inspiring hypostyle hall with its forest of massive columns, stand as enduring testaments to his ambitious building programs. These columns were so enormous that it was said that 100 men could stand on the top of a single one.
Wow. Then comes his son, Ramses II, often dubbed the Great, whose exceptionally long reign is characterized by extensive military campaigns and truly monumental construction projects across Egypt and Nubia. His account of the Battle of Kadesh in his 5th regnal year is particularly legendary.
A dramatic and highly publicized account indeed, heavily promoted by Ramses himself through inscriptions and depictions on temple walls. While the official Egyptian version portrays it as a decisive victory against the Hittite forces, modern historical interpretations suggest it was likely more of a strategic stalemate. The early encounter with Hittite spies, who provided misleading intelligence, certainly placed the Egyptian army at a significant tactical disadvantage at the outset of the campaign.
Right, the spies. And the Egyptian chariots typically had a crew of 2, a driver and an archer, while the Hittite chariots were heavier and carried a crew of 3, including an additional spear thrower. Despite the inconclusive outcome of the battle, Ramses II pointedly refused to agree to a comprehensive peace treaty at that time, opting instead for only a temporary truce.
That's correct. However, he skillfully presented the Battle of Kadesh as a major personal triumph, having detailed narratives and impressive artistic depictions of his bravery carved on virtually every temple he subsequently constructed. It became a powerful and enduring piece of royal propaganda. He also made a significant administrative change by relocating the primary administrative capital from the traditional center of Memphis further north into the Nile Delta region.
Later in his remarkably long reign, Ramses II forged a significant political alliance with the Hittite Empire, even going so far as to marry a Hittite princess as part of the treaty arrangements.
This royal marriage was a major turning point in the relationship between the two great powers, ushering in a period of sustained peace and bringing valuable foreign goods, such as precious stones and lapis lazuli, which were not native to Egypt, into the country. It also led to the remarkable spectacle of Egyptian and Hittite soldiers feasting together in a spirit of amity, a stark contrast to their long history of military conflict. The Hittites, once consistently depicted as one of Egypt's traditional 9 enemies, were now treated as allies.
That's quite a shift. There's even a rather humorous anecdote recorded about the Hittite king requesting the services of an Egyptian physician renowned for his expertise in fertility to treat his sister, and Ramses II's characteristically confident, if slightly boastful, reply.
Yes. It certainly highlights the high regard for Egyptian medical knowledge in the ancient Near East, even while Ramses couldn't resist injecting a bit of personal pride into his response. This burgeoning alliance was further cemented by additional Hittite princesses being sent to marry Ramses, and the full text of the peace treaty was publicly inscribed on temple walls in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, a lasting monument to this new era of cooperation.
Ramses II was also known for his exceptionally large family, fathering over 50 sons. He also experienced significant personal losses, including the death of his eldest son and designated heir, Amun-Her-Khepshef, and his beloved great royal wife, Nefertari.
These personal tragedies undoubtedly had a profound impact on him, even amidst his grand public achievements. He dedicated the magnificent rock-cut temple at Abu Simbel, with its colossal statues, to Nefertari, a powerful testament to his deep affection and respect for her. Some have even drawn a parallel between the scale and impact of Abu Simbel and later monumental projects like Mount Rushmore. The modern-day extensive restoration efforts undertaken on Nefertari's tomb by the Getty Museum highlight both the enduring beauty of these ancient sites and the ongoing challenges of their conservation.
As later dynasties arose in Egypt, the kingdom faced increasing external pressures and threats of foreign invasion. The Libyan campaign of Pharaoh Merneptah is notable for a rather gruesome and culturally specific method of counting the slain enemy.
Yes, instead of the more conventional practice of counting hands, the Egyptians under Merneptah counted the uncircumcised penises of the Libyan dead, a rather derogatory distinction that reflected the Egyptian practice of male circumcision and served as a visual marker of their foreign identity. Pretty grim stuff.
Yikes. Ramses III later famously repelled a major invasion or migration of the enigmatic Sea Peoples, a coalition of various groups from the Mediterranean region.
These were not merely raiding parties. They brought their families and possessions with them in ox carts, indicating a more permanent migration and a search for new lands to settle. Ramesses III successfully fought two major decisive battles against the Sea Peoples in the Nile Delta region, preventing their encroachment into Egypt. His reign also witnessed a significant internal threat, the infamous harem conspiracy.
Ah, the conspiracy. A complex and ultimately unsuccessful plot involving one of his queens, a number of priests who reportedly employed magic in their schemes, and members of the palace guard. The penalties for those implicated in the conspiracy were severe, ranging from various forms of mutilation to impalement. Interestingly, Ramses III himself died before the full trial and sentencing of the conspirators were completed.
Following this period of instability and external threats, we see increasing Libyan influence within Egypt, with Meshwesh chief Shashank eventually rising to power and establishing a new dynasty, often referred to as the 22nd dynasty. His family members came to hold key administrative, religious, and military positions within Egypt. Despite a period of relative stability and wealth, civil war eventually erupted during the reign of Taklot II, and competing independent dynasties began to emerge, particularly in the Nile Delta region. Fragmentation.
Eventually, a new power arose from the south. The Kingdom of Nubia, or Kush, with whom Egypt had a long and complex history of both cooperation and conflict. Kind of a love-hate relationship.
You could say that. The Nubians had, over centuries, adopted many aspects of Egyptian culture, and under the leadership of dynamic rulers like Piye, they ultimately unified Egypt, compelling the various independent northern kings to acknowledge their authority and pay homage to Amun of Napata, the principal deity of their Kushite capital. Piye's famous victory stela provides fascinating details of his campaigns, including his great love for horses and his concern for their proper treatment.
But this period of Nubian dominance was eventually challenged by the expansion of the mighty Assyrian Empire in the Near East. Taharqa, a prominent Nubian pharaoh, initially achieved some military successes against them, but ultimately faced defeat.
Despite legendary accounts of divine intervention or swarms of field mice disrupting the Assyrian army's siege of Jerusalem, Taharqa and his successor, Tutankhamun, were eventually overcome by the superior military might of the Assyrians under rulers like Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal. The Assyrians even sacked the venerable city of Thebes, a truly devastating event that effectively ended Nubian control over Egypt.
This period of Nubian rule and the subsequent waves of foreign invasions inevitably lead to discussions about the complex and often debated topic of the race and ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians and the historical context of Afrocentric perspectives.
This is a nuanced and often sensitive area of historical discussion. Ancient Greek writers did indeed acknowledge this significant cultural influence that ancient Egypt exerted on their own civilization. However, the assertion that Egypt's geographical location within the African continent automatically equates all ancient Egyptians with what is today understood as Black African identity is a considerable oversimplification of complex historical realities. Egyptian artistic representations consistently depict themselves with distinct physical characteristics compared to their Nubian neighbors, who are typically portrayed with darker skin. The 25th dynasty, with its Nubian rulers like Taharqa, represents a period of strong Kushite or Black African influence at the highest levels of Egyptian society, but it does not define the entirety of ancient Egyptian history and identity.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Very complicated. Following the period of Assyrian control, Egypt fell under the sway of the vast Persian Empire. The invasion of Cambyses II, the Persian king, is attributed by ancient sources to various legendary causes, and the Greek historian Herodotus recounts a battle where Persian skulls were supposedly thinner and more fragile than those of the Egyptians. Cambyses II's reign in Egypt is also remembered for the alleged desecration of Egyptian tombs and temples, and stories of his subsequent madness.
While the full accuracy of these ancient accounts is open to scholarly debate, they certainly reflect the widespread Egyptian resistance to Persian rule and the negative perception of Cambyses II. There were numerous subsequent revolts against Persian authority, even under later Persian emperors like Darius I and Xerxes I, who often appointed harsh and oppressive satraps to govern Egypt.
Egypt did manage to regain its independence for a relatively brief period before the final Persian reconquest, leading to the emergence of the last native Egyptian rulers of the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties.
The 29th dynasty notably shifted the royal capital to Mendes in the Nile Delta and saw the prominence of a local ram-headed deity in royal iconography. The 30th dynasty produced notable pharaohs like Nectanebo I and Nectanebo II, who are historically recognized as the last native Egyptian pharaohs to rule before the final Persian takeover. The end of an era, really.
The intricate Egyptian calendar system was deeply intertwined with the cyclical patterns of the Nile River and the heliacal rising of the star Sothis, which we know today as Sirius.
Yeah, the annual reappearance of Sothis on the eastern horizon just before sunrise coincided remarkably closely with the beginning of the Nile's annual flood, a crucial event that brought fertile silt and renewed life to the agricultural lands. Their calendar year was structured around three primary seasons: Akhet, inundation; Kharit, emergence of the land; and Shemu, summer harvest, comprising 12 months of 30 days each, further organized into 10-day weeks.
And those extra 5 days at the end.
Right, the epigomenal days. To more accurately align their calendar with the solar year of approximately 365 days, they ingeniously added these 5 extra days. This 5-day period was a time of significant religious celebration, each day dedicated to the birth of one of the major Egyptian deities. Essentially, these extra 5 days were a clever way they reconciled their 360-day calendar with the actual solar year, and they dedicated this period to celebrating the gods to bridge that gap. Pretty smart.
Despite the numerous foreign incursions, dynastic changes, and periods of instability, the fundamental structure of Egyptian society, with the pharaoh at its apex, supported by a strong military and a wealthy and influential priesthood, demonstrated remarkable endurance over millennia, all underpinned by the central concept of maintaining cosmic order, or Ma'at.
And their beliefs about the afterlife and the associated funerary texts also evolved over this vast span of time, from the early pyramid texts inscribed in the royal pyramids of the Old Kingdom, through the coffin texts that appeared during the First Intermediate Period and Middle Kingdom, ultimately culminating in the more comprehensive and widely used Book of the Dead during the New Kingdom, which served as a detailed guide for the deceased in navigating the perils of the afterlife.
Finally, we arrive at the Ptolemaic dynasty, established by Ptolemy Soter, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals, following Alexander's death and the subsequent division of his vast empire.
Ptolemy Soter, whose epithet Soter translates to savior, is generally regarded as one of the more capable and good rulers of the Ptolemaic line. He effectively established Greek rule over Egypt, with its power center firmly based in the newly founded city of Alexandria. A truly groundbreaking intellectual achievement of his reign was the establishment of the famed Library of Alexandria.
A truly revolutionary institution in the ancient world, with the ambitious goal of amassing all the known knowledge of the time. Its immense collection of papyrus scrolls, potentially numbering in the hundreds of thousands, was unparalleled in its scope. Just imagine.
It was a distinctly Greek concept, representing a significant departure from the more guarded and often secret nature of knowledge preservation within traditional Egyptian temple libraries, where access was often restricted to the priesthood. The Library of Alexandria was intentionally designed to be accessible to scholars, and quickly became a vibrant international hub for intellectual inquiry, attracting some of the greatest thinkers of the age, including Euclid and Eratosthenes.
And the museum, or Maugeon, also established in Alexandria, was another key institution, essentially functioning as the ancient world's first major state-supported think tank, fostering collaboration and research among prominent scholars.
Yes, it was an extraordinary center of intellectual ferment, where groundbreaking discoveries and advancements were made in diverse fields, ranging from mathematics and astronomy to medicine and engineering. For instance, Eratosthenes famously calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy while working at the museum. Another iconic landmark of Ptolemy I's reign, and a testament to Alexandrian innovation, was the construction of the Pharos Lighthouse. Recognized as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Pharos served a crucial secular purpose, guiding ships safely into the bustling harbor of Alexandria. Its impressive 3-tiered structure and towering height made it a truly remarkable feat of engineering. It guided maritime traffic for centuries before eventually succumbing to earthquakes. Many of its substantial stone blocks were later repurposed in the construction of the citadel of Kate, which still stands in Alexandria today. The early Ptolemaic rulers, such as Ptolemy I and his successor Ptolemy II, generally fostered a period of prosperity and continued the generous support of the library and other cultural institutions. Ptolemy II also focused on significant land reclamation projects in the fertile Fayum region to further increase agricultural output, particularly grain production.
Ptolemy III is also generally considered one of the good Ptolemies, notably for his significant contributions to Egyptian religious architecture, including the construction of the magnificent and well-preserved Egyptian temple at Edfu.
This impressive temple, dedicated to the falcon-headed god Horus, demonstrates Ptolemy III's efforts to engage with traditional Egyptian religious practices and cultivate a strong relationship with the powerful Egyptian priesthood. Its walls are extensively adorned with detailed depictions of traditional Egyptian myths and rituals, including the epic contendings of Horus and Seth and the symbolic stretching of the cord ceremony, showcasing a deliberate alignment with ancient Egyptian traditions.
However, the later Ptolemies were increasingly plagued by internal family conflicts, political instability, and a dysfunctional dynastic succession, ultimately leading to Egypt's gradual decline and increasing reliance and dependence on the growing power of Rome. It all started to unravel, didn't it?
Yes, a stark contrast to the relative stability and prosperity of the early Ptolemaic period. Ptolemy XII Auletes, for example, was particularly known for his willingness to pander to Roman interests and was deeply unpopular with the Greek population of Alexandria. Interestingly, a family trip he took to Memphis, where his children, including the future Cleopatra VII, were shown the Serapeum, the burial place of the sacred Apis bull, may have subtly influenced Cleopatra's later fascination with and adoption of aspects of Egyptian culture and religion.
Cleopatra VII herself remains one of the most captivating and enigmatic figures of the ancient world. While Roman propaganda relentlessly portrayed her as a promiscuous seductress, the historical reality appears to have been considerably more complex.
Indeed. While her physical beauty may have been exaggerated for political purposes, she was undoubtedly highly intelligent, multilingual, and strategically astute. Contrary to Roman portrayals, she likely practiced monogamy in her relationships with Caesar and Antony and skillfully leveraged Roman power to maintain her own and Egypt's political autonomy. Early in her reign, she made conscious efforts to Egyptianize her rule, learning the Egyptian language, actively participating in Egyptian religious rituals, and aligning herself with the Egyptian priesthood, a significant departure from many of her Ptolemaic predecessors, who largely remained within the Hellenized confines of Alexandria.
That's a key difference.
When political machinations by her brother's advisors turned the populace against her, she famously fled to Syria and raised an army to reclaim her throne.
Ultimately, the Ptolemaic dynasty and independent Egyptian rule came to an end with decisive Roman intervention. But it's important to remember the earlier, final period of Persian domination that followed the last native Egyptian pharaohs. Nekhtenebeh II holds the distinction of being the last native Egyptian king to be captured by a foreign power and taken out of Egypt, transported to Susa, effectively marking the end of that final flicker of native Egyptian dynastic rule before the long Hellenistic Ptolemaic era began.
Precisely. His capture and removal to the Persian heartland marked a significant turning point, bringing to a close that last brief resurgence of native Egyptian rule before the extended period of Greek Ptolemaic control commenced.
Today, we've journeyed through millennia of ancient Egyptian history, witnessing the rise and fall of powerful dynasties, the ingenuity of their urban planning, the complex dynamics of royal power and succession, the profound evolution of their religious beliefs, and the persistent struggle to maintain Egyptian identity against a backdrop of recurring foreign influence and invasion. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. What truly stands out is the sheer longevity and scope of Egyptian civilization, and how the intricate interplay of individual decisions, cultural beliefs, and unforeseen external events shaped its remarkably enduring and fascinating course. It really prompts reflection on the weight of history and the interconnectedness of different eras.
Indeed. What aspects of this deep dive into ancient Egypt resonated most with you? What specific details have sparked a desire for further exploration? Thank you for joining us once again on Beyond the Known. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the timeless world of Egypt, please take a moment to like, follow, and subscribe for more journeys into the past.